All right, we are starting a new series today that we're going to do over the next 4 weeks, and it's called the I word. And I told you last week we were going to talk about the I word, but I didn't tell you what the I word was. And I'm going to tell you today here in a minute, but we are going to, before we do, I just want to kind of reflect a little bit on the journey that the Lord has taken us on so far this year. At the beginning of the year, we started with a series we called New Year's Revolution. And we talked about the big picture vision of what God has called us to do as a church. And if you remember, some of you may have been here that morning that we talked about that God has put a vision into our church to plant 100 churches. And that morning, we knew that God had given us a big vision. We had no idea how it was going to materialize, how it was going to happen. And throughout the course of even those few months, the Lord put birthed an idea into our hearts to do this, to plant these churches. And we did a thing called the Ignite campaign. That morning we gave every family $50 to take and to multiply for the kingdom of God. We taught a passage out of Scripture over those 3 weeks, and through that we were able to take about $6,000 and multiply it to around $26,000 in a month. And many of you, it was maybe the first time you've seen God working in your finances. You've seen God at work, taking a seed and blessing it and multiplying it. And story after story began to roll in about that. We talked about things like spiritual warfare, spiritual armor. There's a real battle that goes on that we don't see with our eyes, but we sense spiritually going on. We did this a series called Dress to Kill, and talked about using the weapons that God has given us spiritually to fight that battle. We did a series called Come Follow Me. And we talked about discipleship, which is a word. When Jesus had his disciples that followed him, really he was giving us a model for the way that we are to follow him. And we talked about the 4 eyes of discipleship. We did a series called New School, Old Soul. We took some old principles from God's word and looked at how those principles are foundational, even in kind of a new school church with some lights and some different maybe philosophies of how to do church in this day and age, but yet we're rooted in something solid and foundational. And so it's been a journey that the Lord's been taking. And I don't know about you, but I've really started to feel God building off of each one of these series and taking us to a new level in him. As we're preparing to do this series called the I Word, I just started to think about the fact that as we enter into a relationship with Jesus, it is just totally different than any other relationship we have with anyone else, especially the communication part of that relationship. Like, I'm not sure if I've ever heard this particular thing I'm about to talk about right now. I'm not sure if I've ever heard this talked about in church. I'm pretty sure we all wrestle with it. Like, communicating with God isn't easy. Like, communicating with people isn't easy, right? And we speak the same language. We all in here speak English. If you don't speak English, this might be the wrong service for you. You're going to have a hard time understanding, right? We all speak English. We understand the nuances of communication, that we can say certain words, but we communicate with more than just our words. We communicate with our eyes. We communicate with our body language. We communicate with our tone of voice. Right? I could say the same word in 2 different ways. It means 2 different things. If you give me some news and I say, great, that means something. That means I'm happy. If you give me some news and I say, great, it means something totally different. Have you ever received a text message from somebody or an email and it said a certain thing and you're like, I wish I could have seen their face when they wrote that because I'm not exactly sure what they mean when they sent that. And communication's a tough thing with people that we know and people that we have relationships with and people that we speak the same language. Think about the communication gaps in your marriage, intimate relationships. I mean, that's tough. I mean, husbands and wives who know each other intimately, speak the same language, have lived in the same house, slept in the same bed, had kids together. No, I mean, just have had experience after experience together, have done numerous things, spent countless hours together, and yet you can still miscommunicate with that person. How much tougher is it to communicate to God or to receive communication from God? And if you've ever seen somebody that really seemed to be in tune with God differently than you are, I mean, you ever heard somebody say like, yeah, God spoke to me and told me to do this. He spoke to me, he told me to do this. You're like, really? What was that like? Because we don't hear God's voice. And so we get into this communication process that's sort of abstract. The other tough thing about communicating with God is the emotional connection with God. Sometimes it's tough to connect to God emotionally. Like, we receive emotion, we receive love from people through words of affirmation. Somebody say, I love you, tell you I love you, right? How many of you know that when you tell somebody you love them, when you walk down the aisle and marry them, that's not enough? You got to keep telling them, right? Even though they said till death do us part, it's good every once in a while to hear your husband or your wife or hear your parent or somebody that you have a loving relationship with say, I love you, I care about you. It's nice to be reassured of that. But we don't hear God's audible voice. It's nice to be able to feel the physical touch. How many of you have ever been going through something hard? You're like, I just need somebody to hug me, I just need somebody to touch me. I just need to feel the presence of someone, especially if you're wired that way for physical touch. And yet we don't ever feel the physical touch of God. And we don't see God. When you're in the absence of your family or people you care about, you're absent from them, it creates a little distance in the relationship. And yet we don't ever see God with our eyes. And so we're in a relationship with God, and the way we communicate with him is different than the way we're really wired to communicate and the way that we communicate with other people. And so what happens then is we're following God, we believe in God, we with all of our hearts want to be connected to God and do what he says and obey him, but yet there sometimes is this emotional detachment, and there's this absence of understanding maybe his voice and what he's saying to us. And so there's a temptation that comes in, and what happens is we tend to gravitate toward things that fulfill us emotionally. We tend to gravitate toward things that can reciprocate our emotion, that can hug back, that can talk back, that can give us fulfillment, that can make us feel good about ourselves, that make us feel secure and happy. And all of these things that we gravitate toward are called idols. Now, when I say the word idol, it probably conjures up an image in your head of some statue. Because since the beginning of time, there's been idols. There's been idolatry. There's been things that people have worshiped. And an idol, I guess a simple definition would be anything that you worship besides God. Anything that is placed higher than God, anything that's more valuable to you than God is an idol. And an idol could be anything. It could be anything. We think of idols, we think of bad things generally. We think of money, or we think of sex, or we think of power as idols, that things that people serve other than God. But idols could certainly be those things, but an idol could be something else as well. An idol could be a blessing from God, something that God has given you, something that God has honored you with. And yet if even the good things in life, if we take them and we make them more important than God, then we take God, capital G, God's blessings, and turn them into God, lowercase g, gods. And at that point, they become idols in our lives. And I think sometimes when we read passages in the Old Testament, or we hear about cultures, past cultures, and we hear about idols, we think, well, that's kind of weird. That's something that they did. They bowed down to statues, and that's odd. We don't do that in this day and age, and we think idols are something from the past, but actually idols are something that have been present in every generation, in every culture, in all of time. You go back in the Old Testament, and let me just quickly summarize the Old Testament for you. Go ahead, bring that slide up about the cycle that the children of Israel went through in the Old Testament. It would start out, they would be living in prosperity. Things would be good. Their land was blessed. The crops were good. The economy was good. Militarily, they were not being oppressed. Everything was good. It was rosy. It was sunny. Things were wonderful. They were living in prosperity. And then they would turn away from God. And they would turn to some idol. It would sometimes be a statue. It would be some graven image. It would be something that they bowed to, that their heart turned away from God to something tangible. Why? Because they felt removed from God. They weren't emotionally connected to God. They couldn't understand God. They couldn't hear his voice, so to speak. And so yet, here's something, although it's fake, it's here. It's tangible. I can see it. I can bow down to it. I can touch it. And so they would turn from God to some sort of idol. And then because their hearts turned from God, God would judge them. He would send judgment. And sometimes it would be a nation that would come in and take over militarily. Sometimes it would be a famine that would hit the land and their crops would dry up. And in some way they would come into a place that they really were reminded of the true God. And then they would cry out for help, right? This is kind of like when you paddle your kid. And they're like, they start crying. They hold their hands up to you. Please stop, right? Don't do this anymore. And you're like, all right, okay, all right. So, you get a couple swats, right? And then eventually, like basically the nations, the famines would be like God's paddle. Like, psh, what are you doing? Why are you turning? Psh, right? And then they would cry out to him, and then God would rescue them. At some point, he would stop paddling them. And they would come back. They would turn their hearts back after God rescued them. Their hearts would turn back to God, and they would acknowledge the one true God. And this happened over. Then they'd be prosperity, boom, 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 over again. That's the Old Testament. It's the story of the Old Testament. And the books that we hear, that we read of the prophets, and Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, all these Old Testament books are prophets that would stand up to the nation and say, hey, what are you doing? What are you doing? You've turned to an idol. You've turned away from God. Your heart is away from God. And people would get so frustrated because things were collapsing in their nation, collapsing in their life. And they would cry out and go, what's up, God? Why would you do this to us? And yet they were turned from God. And these prophets would say, what are you doing? You have an idol. And this idol is causing you to follow it, and you've lost the blessing of God. And so they would come back, and this happened over and over and over again. I have to think that as this is happening to Israel, second, third, fourth generation, that they're looking back at their history and going, boy, that's weird what they did. That's weird that they worshiped that particular statue. It's weird that they bowed to that particular lowercase g. Why would they do that? That makes no sense. And yet it continued to happen because every culture, every generation, idols come to the surface. Things step into God's place in our hearts. And it is no different with our culture. And it's no different with this day and age. Over the next 3 weeks, I'm going to talk about this. And this is going to be a little painful. It's going to be a little painful for me. It has been in my preparation time. The Lord's began revealing some idols in my own heart. I believe if you come in with eyes open to hear the word from the Lord, that you will receive as well, that God will start to speak to you. And it could be of something that really you've grown so attached to that it's become a lowercase g God in your life. Begin to move itself right to the center of your life. Today I just want to kind of lay the groundwork for where we're going to go. In the Old Testament, these prophets that I was talking about, Hosea, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, they used 3 analogies to help us understand idols. The first one that they talked about was Hosea talks about spiritual adultery. So it's an analogy. Basically, it was an analogy to help us see that when we choose to put something else at the center of our life, it's as if we are committing adultery on God spiritually. We worship this thing, we unite with this thing, and we are supposed to be united with God in a relationship with him, and we go outside of that. Another way that this is talked about in the Old Testament is political. It talks about serving. We're supposed to serve God. We serve other gods, and so there's the political analogy. Then there's the religious analogy where it talks about worshiping, that we worship other things other than God. We sacrifice to those things. We make sacrifices to those things other than God. But then in the New Testament, we see it as well in Acts 17 when Paul is going around and he is doing his missionary journeys, planting churches around the world. We talked about that last week. When he was doing that, he would go into these different cities and he would see the shrines that had been built up to their idols. And so in order for Paul to bring the gospel into these communities, he had to expose the idols in their community. So look at this one in Acts chapter 17. We're going to jump around a little bit in Acts 17, but Acts 17:16, Paul goes to a place called Athens. And it says this, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply troubled by all the idols he saw everywhere in the city. Everywhere he looked, he would see these idols up and around, and he thought, man, I've got to bring the gospel to these people, help them see the truth. So he saw it all over the place. Go ahead and skip down to, I believe it's verse 23. 2. So Paul's standing before the council, so he's wanting to help these people see the idols of their day. It says he addressed them as follows. Men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious in every way. For as I was walking along, I saw your many shrines, and one of your altars had this inscription on it, to an unknown God. This God whom you worship without knowing is the one I'm telling you about. He is the God who made the world and everything in it. Since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't live in man-made temples, and human hands can't serve his needs. For he has no needs. He himself gives life and breath to everything, and he satisfies every need. So basically what Paul is saying in Athens is, hey, these things, these man-made things that you have been worshiping and you have been calling gods are not gods at all. Paul was addressing a problem that has happened all through time and continues to happen today. Now, anything can be an idol. It doesn't have to be, we don't have to bow down to it physically. In fact, probably today, most of us don't have things that, certain idols, like in the ancient times that we bow to physically in reverence, but yet bowing down to something in your own heart is every bit as bad, if not worse, than bowing down before something physically. And you can make an idol out of anything. It could be good things. It could be your family and children. Here's a few things I wrote down as I was thinking about potential idols. It could be your family or children. It could be your career and making money. It could be achievement. Maybe you have an inner desire, a drive to achieve and to accomplish. Maybe it's a social standing. Maybe you look and say, man, if I could get to that point, if I could run in that crowd, if I could ascend to that place, then I would be happy. Maybe it's material possessions. Maybe you have in your mind a checklist. Man, I want to get that thing. I want to get that brand of thing, that brand of car. I want to live in that neighborhood. I want these material possessions and your life becomes about these things. It could be a romantic relationship. It could be a person that you have allowed to become more important than God. Somebody that clouds your vision, that as you enter into that relationship with them, the things they say and whatever it takes to keep that person, it becomes more important than God. Could be competence and skill. Maybe you have abilities and skills that you've put at a place of prominence in your life, and your whole life revolves around your skill. And all you think about all the time is, how do I develop this skill? How do I get better at this? It becomes an idol. It could be your physical beauty, personally, or in your partner, that you worship that. Your whole life becomes about preserving that. Could be a worthy cause. Maybe you have a certain cause that's maybe it's a great cause, social or political cause that you really believe in, and it's become so prominent in your life that you absolutely live for it beyond God. And if God tells you to do something opposite of that, you will obey that thing because it's more important to you than God. It could be your moral record. You're really proud of the fact you've really kept your nose clean in life, and you've not been one of the shysters in life, but you've lined up, and you're really proud of your moral code. Maybe it's your religion. Man, we see this. People that cling to religious traditions above God, above what God would say and speak to you specifically. It could be anything. Idol is something that when you look into your heart and you think, if I just have that thing, if I can just possess that thing, then life will have meaning. Then life will be worth living. Then I will hit the point of satisfaction in life. Anything besides God that you look at in that way. Also, if you look at something, maybe you have something, you've already attained it, and you think, if I lose this thing, life won't be worth living anymore. If I lose this thing, this person, this position, this career, if I lose this thing, then everything I've worked for will have fallen apart. And if I lose that, life would lose its purpose, would lose its meaning completely. That thing's become an idol. You see, when we have the things that God has given us, the relationships, the people, the possessions, the opportunities, when we have those in the proper perspective and we see those as good things, blessings from God, but not idols, if we lose them, we're sad. We're sad, we're upset, we grieve a certain amount of grief, and yet we move on because we have them in their proper context. But if we have made an idol of something and we lose that thing, now we go to a place of complete despair. We're beyond sad, we're suicidal, or we've lost purpose and we're completely stagnant. I guess an idol is something other than God that you feel like you can't live without. Anything beyond God that you say, I can't live without this thing. Idol is the thing that motivates you. It drives you. It's your purpose. When you're sitting just kind of, no pun intended, idly by, and you begin to think, what's the thing that your mind just keeps gravitating toward? What's the thing that you just continue to think about other than God? It could be some idolatry. You may have an idol problem in your life. And really idolatry, when we look at it, idols, they're really at the root of all of our sin. In fact, let me show you this. In the 10 Commandments, go ahead and bring the 10 Commandments up. 10 Commandments, this is an Old Testament, the book of Exodus, chapter 20. God gives these 10 rules. Obviously, God, there's more things than just this, but these are the 10. He's like, all of creation, doesn't matter what race you are, gender, doesn't matter what season of time you live in, doesn't matter your generation. This is for everyone. First one is, have no other gods before me. That's the first one. So you have no idols. And the second one is, have no false gods before me. So he's saying, put me at the very top. The first 2 commandments set the tone for all the other commandments. In fact, I would venture to say that you can't break commandment 3 through 10 unless you break commandment 1 and 2. Commandment 1 and 2, idolatry, is the sin beneath every sin that you commit, whatever it is. So if you're here and you've got a certain sin in your life that you just feel like you can't get past, and you've tried willpower, you've tried telling a friend about it, you've tried all kinds of things, and it just keeps coming to the surface. It's a behavioral issue you just can't seem to get past. It happens over and over and over again, and you're fighting the good fight. You're losing hope. Why is my behavior not changing? I'm coming to church now. I'm singing the worship songs. I'm listening to the Christian songs on my iPod. I'm reading the soap scripture of the day. I'm doing all the things I need to do. I've confessed. I've moved on, but I just keep struggling with this sin. Why? It's because there's a sin beneath the sin, and that sin is you have an idol in your life. Let me give you a real tangible example. Okay, let's pretend like my kids have become an idol in my life. Okay. And so my kids have caused me to break commandment 1 and 2. That I now have a God before God. That there's a false idol in my life, and it's my children. And I look to my children to give me gratification. I look to my children to give me purpose. I look to my children to make life worth living. I will take scripture and I will kind of twist it to fit the way that I want to raise my children. Everything is about my children, my world, everything, okay? So I've made a God out of my children. Well, because I've broken that commandment, the first 2, now all of a sudden these other ones do not steal. Maybe I don't go like, rob Meyer or rob a bank. Maybe I don't physically steal, but maybe it causes me to sin in that I steal time from work. I steal time. I work a job I'm not really into, but I do it. Why? Because my kids become an idol, and I want to get them everything they want. I want to be able to provide the cool things. I want to be able to go above and beyond and do all these things. They become more important than my integrity. So I'll steal. I might even lie. I might lie because my kids are a lowercase g. They're a God in my life. And so when I'm talking to another parent about their kid, I might even embellish some things about my God because I want them to think my God's bigger than their God. So I lie about my kids. Or I lie for my kids. I might twist the truth. I might cheat. I might be coaching Little League or something silly, but I cheat for my kids. I help them cheat in school. I help them cheat on just little things that, it doesn't like change the course of, our culture. It's just little things, but yet they're sins. I'm breaking commandments. I'm doing something opposed from God. Why? Because this thing has become an idol in my life. If my career is in here, it might cause me to do other things. It might cause me to steal, lie. It might cause me to covet. Okay, and when something comes to the center of our lives, somebody that looks like they've got it all together on the outside, they're all put together, you're capable of atrocity. You're capable of terrible things. Why? Because something has broken commandment 1 and 2 in your life, and so now 3 through 10 are fair game. Everything is fair game. And there's no sin that we commit. There's nothing that we commit that there's not underneath it an underlying idol. If I lie about statistics, it's because something, maybe it's the way that people view me. Maybe it's my reputation and it's become an idol. It's more important than my integrity. If I commit adultery, maybe it's because something's a selfish part of myself. I've become an idol. Pleasure has become an idol to me above my integrity, my character, my obedience to God. And so until we deal with the idols, until we really get down to the nitty-gritty and go past just the behavioral sins. Because if we don't deal with the idols, the behavioral sins, that's just the surface. So I can sit and tell you, you ought to do this, and you ought to get an accountability partner, and you ought to confess. That's all part of the process. But if you don't deal with the idol underneath, what is it? What's the thing that you're worshiping? What's the thing that's become more important to you than God, than anything else? Then you will continue in that behavior. You'll continue to spiral, and everything else will just be an oversimplification of behavioral modification, and you'll never move past that. So there's a sin beneath the sin. Anytime we look to something else to save us, to create a sense of purpose, to be an ultimate value in our life, we've created an idol. We will either worship the uncreated God or we will worship some created thing. Now, maybe there's one person in here that's thinking, he's not talking to me. I don't have any idols. I've got my priorities completely in line. Maybe you do. But I will tell you this, all of us worship something. We all live for something. As long as you're alive, you are living for something. And it's either an uncreated God, the uncreated God of the universe. That's the only thing in the world worth worshiping. It's the only God worth having. Or you're worshiping something that has been created. Either God's created it or something that you've created. So there's no possibility of us worshiping nothing. So here's what we're going to do. Over the next 3 weeks, we are going to take a look at 3 kinds of idols. We're going to look at personal idols, we're going to look at religious idols, and we're going to look at cultural idols. Next week, we're going to look at cultural idols, the idols of our culture. And in that, you may begin to see some things where you're like, oh man, I've fallen into that trap. You won't be alone, I promise you. The next week, we're going to talk about religious idols because those are some of the most seductive. Those are some of the idols that we can do thinking that we're doing God's will, and yet we've taken this thing that we're doing for God and we've made it bigger than God. We'll talk about that in 2 weeks. And then the third, in the series finale, we're going to talk about personal idols. Things that God has given us, blessed us with, specific things that we've taken and we've created little g gods instead of worshiping the big G God. When I was a freshman in high school, I was playing basketball, and I was reaching for a loose ball, and one guy was running this way, one guy was running that way, and I felt this terrible pain in my wrist. Hurt so bad. But I didn't want everyone to think I was a wimp, so I just kind of kept playing, and this pain wouldn't go away in my wrist. I didn't want to tell my coach. I thought if I tell my coach, he's going to take me out of the game or he's going to make me go see the trainer. And if I'm injured, then I won't be able to play. So I just kind of kept dealing with this pain, and it didn't go away. It stayed with me for the days and weeks to come, and it started to get worse. And I could kind of move my wrist about like that, but it was it was painful. But I could deal with it. You know, it didn't completely incapacitate me. I could still catch and shoot. There was some pain involved, but it wasn't completely debilitating. And over the next 2 years, from my freshman to my junior year, I just dealt with this pain. And I can remember a few instances. One time, actually, I fell and braced myself, and I remember it hurting again. I remember I played quarterback in high school. I took a snap, and the ball hit my bottom hand. Oh, man, it really hurt. And I remember a few different times. And finally, my junior year, 2 years after I injured it, it got hurting so bad, continued to hurt. I went to my parents. I said, look, I've got to go check this out. Something's up with my wrist. It's been hurting for 2 years. And so we go to the doctor, and the doctor takes an x-ray, and he says, your wrist is still broken. He said, you broke the smallest bone in your wrist, called the scaphoid bone, smallest bone. He said, now it's kind of normal for people to break it and not know they've broken it because you can kind of still use it. But he said, it's broken. He said, so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to do a bone graft. We're going to literally have to go into your forearm, take some bone out, put it in your wrist, and put a screw in your wrist. He said, we're going to have to do surgery. He said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to numb your arm from the shoulder down, but you're going to be awake. And he said, you can choose. He said, we're going to have a TV screen. There will be like a curtain over your shoulder. He said, and there's going to be a TV screen. You can watch movies if you want, or you can even watch the surgery. I was like, that sounds like kind of cool. So I'm sitting there, and I start watching the surgery, and my arm's totally dead. I've got to tell you, it was the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life. I'm sitting there, I'm watching, and 2 feet on the other side, they're cutting me open, and they open up my wrist and bone and all this kind of stuff and blood. And I'm like, I think I'll just watch a movie. Thank you. But I think I'll watch a movie. About halfway through the surgery, we put in like Hoosiers or something. And I watched the movie, and they did this surgery on my wrist, and they got in there, and they had to. I wish I could have just got through with a brace. I wish I could have done something simple, but they literally had to cut me open. They had to dig inside, and they had to do some serious business. Now, I hear this in church a lot where people say, I want to go deep. I want to dig deep. I want a church that's deep, that goes beneath the surface. And a lot of times I think what they're saying is, I want somebody to talk these kind of complex, intellectual, spiritual conversations, theological, that just sort of confuse me, but yet make me feel like I've got a new cool piece of material I can tell people about, instead of what real deep is spiritually, is opening yourself up to God and saying, go ahead and come inside me, look inside me, and see the things that need to change. In fact, David said this in a Psalm, I believe Psalm 139:23. He says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you and lead me along the path to everlasting life. David said, look, this hurts, but cut me open and do the surgery that you need to do. Otherwise, I'm going to continue to walk around with this wrist that doesn't quite act like it should, and it continues to bring me pain and continues to slow my life down and cause me issue after issue. And so here's what I'm inviting you into. I'm inviting you over the next 3 weeks to make it a priority to listen to God, to come in on Sunday mornings and hear these messages. If you can't be here to watch or listen to the podcast, and say, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. See if there's anything inside of me to truly say, Lord, if it's a bond in a relationship that I put above you, or I put in front, and it's become a lowercase g, it's become an idol in my life, then Lord, show me the healthy way, the thing that would please you to move forward. If it's a career, if it's an attachment to something material, if it's an attitude, whatever it might be, to open yourself up. Because I guarantee you this, that if you continue to nurse the idol around with your wrist, and you continue to just live with it, it will never fully be healed. The only reason that I allowed the doctor to cut, and I still have a scar on my wrist that reminds me of that surgery, the only reason that I allowed him to do it is because the doctor told me, if we don't stop and we don't cut open and we don't dig deep, then you'll never recover. You'll never fully be healed from this. So my prayer for you, my prayer for me, is as we look at the idols that are in our lives, we look at the things that have become ultimate things in our lives other than God, that he will expose that thing and that we will see healing. Let's go deep together.